Hello, so today we're going to have a look at Surds, which is a completely new topic that you won't have seen before. Surds generally are a grade AA star at GCSE, so you will see them at the end of your exam papers alongside things like indices with negative or fractional powers. Pause the video now and write this into your books, please. So what we mean by surd is something that has a square root, and this is an example. So the root 2, square root of 2, so we just sort of abbreviate that to root 2, is an example of a surd. And what you will need to know for your GCSE is some of the rules about how surds behave. So the first things first, what happens if I take the square root of 2 and multiply it by the square root of 2? Now, if you remember your work from the start of the year, we know that we can write the square root of 2 as 2 to the power of a half. If I'm timesing it then by the square root of 2 here, what I'm essentially doing is squaring the whole thing. And we know from our rules of indices that when I've got a bracket with the powers, I multiply them. And a half times by 2 gives me the power of 1, and so will give me just 2. So if I'm taking the square root of, let's say, 5 and multiplying it by the square root of 5, I will get back to 5 again. So any surd squared will just give you the number inside the surd again. That's the first thing. So you could make some notes on that, please. So here are some other examples that I want to go through. So what happens when you multiply surds that have got different values inside that root? Well, you can actually just combine them. So here, the square root of 2 multiplied by the square root of 3, we can combine that as a multiplication inside the root. So here we get an answer of just root 6. With the next question, I've got a 3 in front of that square root, but we just leave that on the outside and we can still multiply the 2 times by 3 inside, so we will get 3 lots of the root of 6. With the next example, I've got whole numbers on the outside and the square roots, so I'm going to take those step by step. So first of all, I'm going to do the 4 times by the 6 on the outside of the surd, and on the inside of the surd I've got the 5 and the 3 being multiplied together, so I've got 5 times by 3. So in total this will give me 24 lots of root 15. And the final example, just to reiterate the previous point, here I've got a 5 and a 2 on the outside, so when I multiply those together, I know that's going to give me 10. And inside the surds, I've got a root 3 and a root 3. So that's the same as having, we can take the previous one and just make that a 3, or we can say that's the root of 3 times by 3. So that's going to give me 10 lots of the square root of 9. And the square root of 9, we know that is 3. So 10 times by 3. So that answer gives us 30. But obviously, there is another way you could have done that. So if you noticed at this point here that the square root of 3 times by the square root of 3 is going to give you just 3 on its own, you could have just written times by 3 instead. So we've got 10 times by 3 to get 30. I don't mind which way you do it, whichever one you feel most comfortable with, really. Okay, so what I'd like you to do again is write these into your book as examples before having a look at the next set. Okay, simplifying surds is a major part of what you'll be asked to do, and not just asked to do, but expected to do for your own, of your own accord. So before we go on to look at how we simplify surds, you're going to need to recall your square numbers. So starting at the beginning, we've got 1, which we get from 1 times 1. 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared, 8 squared, 9 squared, and then 10 squared. It is worth you going on to do the next few from this. I'd say probably up to your 15. So 11 squared, 12 squared, 13 squared, 14 squared, and then 15 squared. So it's worth you just trying to remember a few of those extra ones as well, in case the odd question comes up. So begin by writing those into your book, and then I will go through and explain how we simplify. So here is an example of a question. Simplify the root of 20. So the way that we do this with a surd is we need to split 20 up into a square number multiplied by any other type of number. So if I think about the number 20, you can think about the factors of 20. We've got 1 times by 20, but although 1 is a square number, it's not really going to help us out here, and you'll see why in a minute. 2 times by 10, well, neither of those are square numbers. And then we've got 4 times by 5. So I can see here 4 is in my list of square numbers, so I'm going to work with that. So I'm going to rewrite 20 as the square root of 4 times by 5. Because 4 times by 5 does give me 20, but now what I can do with this 4 is I can actually take the square root of it. Because it's a square number, it does have a whole number, an integer square root. So the square root of 4 is 2, and I've got 2 root 5. Let's have a look at another example. So if I asked you to simplify the root of 80. Okay, 80, it's quite easy for you to fall into the trap of just saying, oh, 4 times by 20 gives you 80. So I'll rewrite this as 4 times by 20, and that gives me 2 root 20. Now, the word simplify, it does mean that you need to simplify it as far as possible. And we can already see from our previous example that the square root of 20 can actually be simplified further. So when you get to what you think is your final answer, you do need to do a final check and just make sure it can't get simplified any further. Now, if I've got this 2 outside here, and I'm going to be taking the square root of this 4 now, what you need to do with those numbers is multiply them. So I've got a 2 on the outside already. I'm going to have another 2 from where I take this square root of 4, and then I'm going to be left with the square root of 5. So that's going to give me an answer of 4 root 5. So that is the square root of 80 simplified. There is a quicker way to do it, and the quicker way to do it is to find the highest square number that goes into 80. So if we look back at our numbers, or thinking about our factors of 80, actually 16 goes into 80. So 80 is the same as 16 times by 5, okay, so in the 16 times table. So if I then take the square root of that 16, I will get 4 root 5. Now, obviously, this would be your preferred method, being able to kind of just get the highest number and simplify it in one step. But it's important that you know what to do if you do it in small steps, which is why I've also included this section here. And just remember, the really important part is if you've got a number on the outside already and you're taking a square root, you do multiply those together. So let's have a look at some examples of where you'll need to put that simplifying into practice. So this is where you are going to need to multiply and simplify some surds. And again, this simplify is the really important one, because this is the one that tells you you need to take your answer and write it in sort of the lowest form possible. So 2 ways to do this. You can either simplify them first, your surds, and then multiply them, or you can multiply them first and then spend time at the end simplifying. I prefer to simplify first and then do the multiplying part second, and I'll show you now why. So if I have a look at this, I've got the square root of 3. Can't simplify that any further. 3 is a prime number, so there is no square number that goes into it. The square root of 18 can be written as 9 times by 2, where 9 is a square number. I'll move this out of the way. So carrying on, I've got root 3 times by 3 root 2, and I know from the practice at the beginning that that's going to give me 3 root 6. There are no square numbers that go into 6, it can't be simplified any further, so that is my final answer. Okay, question 2 I'll do on the side here. So it was the square root of 2 times by the square root of 10. Now, these can't be simplified. There isn't a square number that goes into 10, and 2 is a prime number. So I'm going to have to do this in the other way round. So that gives me the square root of 20. Ask yourself now, is there a square number that goes into 20? Yes, there is. That square number is 4. So if I take the square root of 4, I will get 2, and that gives me 2 root 5. So that is root 2 times by root 10, simplified as far as possible. And then the final example over here, the square root of 18 times by the square root of 2. So you saw before, I like to simplify that first. So that for me is 9 times by 2, where 9 is a square number, times by root 2. So that gives me 3 root 2 times by root 2. We know that what happens when I multiply a root 2 by a root 2 and I square it, that's going to give me just a whole 2. So the answer to that is 6. Now, as you are doing these questions, work through them independently, but you can always check your answers on a calculator afterwards. Saying that though, they do normally come up on non-calculator papers. So pop those in as examples and then have a go at the worksheet.